Thank you so much. Charlene Mitchell co-founded the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. Charlene's life's work defines organized grassroots people power and why justice is not possible without collective, organized struggles. Please understand that those of us who came of political age in the 1970s, we owe you so much. Welcome our comrade Charlene Mitchell. Reading Charlene's remarks is Pat Fry, our friend and our colleague, a co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. And no matter where the labor movement sends Pat to organize, in her heart, she still is a Michigander.
Good afternoon, sisters and brothers, comrades and friends. It is a great honor for me to be asked by Charlene Mitchell to read her remarks here today in tribute to Henry Winston. Charlene is my mentor, my comrade, my compañera, and friend. The reason is stated best by the person we honor here today. I'd like to read an inscription from the inside cover of Charlene's copy of Strategy for a Black Agenda. I found it on her bookshelf a few weeks ago, and it was written, of course, by Henry Winston. To Charlene Mitchell, it is with pride and joy that I am a close co-worker of one whose exceptional abilities make her one of the finest leaders of our party and its science, Marxism-Leninism. Your brilliant leadership in helping to found the recently formed National Defense Organization Against Racism and Repression is but an example of your untiring efforts in the battle for Black liberation. You are a sterling representative of Black womanhood and a beautiful and effective tribune in forging the path of struggle against monopoly and for socialism. Henry Winston. Charlene's remarks. Good afternoon. It is an honor to be present at an event to honor the life, work, and thought of Henry Winston. I count myself as among the lucky ones who had the privilege of working with Comrade Winston over a number of years and in a number of struggles. Marx wrote that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Henry Winston made history, but his contribution to history was not based on his unique genius, although he was a genius. The history he made was grounded in the world he lived in. Growing up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and Kansas City, he experienced firsthand the brutal oppression of the African American people and the callous exploitation of the working class. In Hattiesburg in the early 1900s, more than one half of the town was African American, yet 1% of them were registered to vote due to the disenfranchisement of the African American people in the South. His father was a laborer in a local sawmill who struggled to feed, clothe, and house his young family on the meager wages of the mill. Thus, from birth, Winston's life was intertwined with the two social forces that would mark his future life: a member of the working class, viciously exploited by the capitalist system, and an African American subjected to the base degradations of national oppression. As a fighter, Winston grew to adulthood organizing against these twin forms of oppression. He was a leader of the Young Communist League, the Unemployed Councils, and the Scottsboro Defense Committee. In the midst of these struggles, he honed the theoretical and organizational abilities that would serve him so well later as a leading member of the Communist Party. Many of Winston's most lasting theoretical contributions are in the areas of the anti-colonial and independent struggles of Africa and the movement for African American equality. Although his personal life experiences certainly gave him important insights into these issues, it was not a sense of nationalism that drove his analysis. Instead, it was a firm belief in the future of socialism and the historic role of the working class in bringing about that future. Winston was fully aware of Lenin's admonition that Marxism cannot be mixed with even the most refined forms of nationalism. In a 1964 pamphlet entitled Negro Liberation, A Goal for All Americans, Winston referred to the African American question as the touchstone in the struggle for democracy in this country, adding that the achievement of equality for the Negro people is the key in the struggle to defend and extend democracy for all. Winston was an advocate of the centrality of the struggle for African American equality. He understood that the fight against African American oppression was central to the uniting of the working class. He understood that this centrality could not be posed against the class struggle, as some social democrats attempted to do by insisting that only the class struggle is central. Instead, Winston understood the interconnection between the class struggle and the struggle against national oppression. He also understood that no movement would lead the U.S. working class towards the fundamental transformation of this system without a correct understanding of the centrality of the fight against African American oppression. The white sector of the U.S. working class will never break with bourgeois ideology without cleansing itself of the odious ideology of racial superiority in whatever form it takes. These ideas, the struggle for a correct line in the African American and African support movement, are the centerpiece of Winston's strategy for a Black agenda. In that work, which was a major intervention in the ideological struggle within the African American movement and among those in solidarity with African liberation and independence, Winston pulled the covers off of the Maoists, who, under the guise of anti-revisionism, sided with the imperialists in the struggle for the liberation of Angola. More importantly, Winston's analysis demonstrated that these positions were not merely mistakes or errors in judgment by the Maoists, but were the logical outcome of an anti-Leninist, anti-working class philosophy. In Strategy for a Black Agenda and in Class, Race, and Black Liberation, Winston dissected the then current Pan-Africanist movement. He distinguished between the nationalism and lack of anti-imperialist character of the Pan-Africanism by George Padmore and Marcus Garvey on the one hand, and the conception of Black Africanism or Pan-Africanism of W.E.B. Du Bois. Winston noted that Padmore and Garvey were quick to base their analysis on Du Bois' famous quote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Winston added, however, that Du Bois said that the color line was the problem. Du Bois did not say it was the solution. The solution, said Winston, in quoting Lenin, lies in a strategy to overcome the disunity of the oppressed and exploited at the point of differences in color and nationality. Comrade Winston's leadership on these issues were not limited to the theoretical sphere. He played an active role in guiding mass movements in these areas. Winston was the organizational brains behind the formation of NAMESAL, the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in solidarity with African liberation. Under his guidance and through his connections with African leaders throughout the continent, NAMESAL succeeded in injecting a consistent anti-imperialist content to the then developing movements in solidarity with African liberation. NAMESAL was one of the first organizations in this country to campaign for the freedom of Nelson Mandela, and with the National Alliance, launched a petition drive that helped make Mandela's freedom a national issue. Much of NAMESAL's work laid the basis for the larger African liberation support movement that developed in the 1980s. And under Winston's guidance, the Communist Party helped build the largest political defense movement this country has seen since the Scottsboro defendants. I can still remember receiving a call from my brother, Franklin Alexander, in the summer of 1970, informing me that Angela Davis was facing arrest on trumped-up charges stemming from a shootout at a courthouse in San Rafael, California. I immediately went to discuss this development with Winston and Gus Hall. Both had no hesitation in throwing the weight of the entire party behind the movement to defend Angela. Both immediately saw this threat as an attack against the Communist Party, the African American movement, and the entire progressive movement. Winston especially demonstrated a particular sensitivity to the role of gender. It was an advanced attitude I had seen displayed by him over the years. In his work in defense of Angela, he consistently expressed the importance of the role of women in the movement's leadership and in broader society. This may have partially been due to the influence of Claudia Jones, one of his closest comrades from the old days, and at one time chair of the party's Women's Commission. With Winston's assistance, we rallied the party to build an international movement demanding the release of Angela and all political prisoners. This movement, more than any other single motion, helped rebuild the party's image in the African American community and in the broad left. There are still many activists around who cut their teeth in that movement, and in the process of building that movement, the party made many valuable contacts with activists across the country. It was this movement that positioned us to launch the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. In Winston's last years, he had developed a particular concern for the plight of African American youth. He recognized that the general crisis of capitalism and the national oppression of the African American people were combining to stigmatize African American youth as social pariahs, in Winston's words. More than 25 years later, we see Winston's concerns manifested in today's astronomical youth unemployment rates, collapsing public education, and mass incarceration as a method of control of African American youth. Yet Winston was full of optimism about the long-range future. I believe he would have welcomed the election of Barack Obama to the presidency, as Jarvis has already mentioned, and he would have been the first to point out the importance of the 2012 elections for the future of our country. Just think about Winston's notion about the African American question being the touchstone in the struggle for democracy, while listening to the racist dog whistles, some would say foghorns, of every single one of the Republican Party candidates. And line up opposing these dog whistlers are, albeit with Obama at the head, a united African American community, the organized sector of the working class, which is newly energized, and nearly all organized sections of the progressive movement. How could one be neutral in this fight and consider oneself a progressive or even a small d Democrat? And make no mistake, to support a third-party candidate in this election is to be neutral, the definition of neutrality being that of having little or no impact. We all have our criticisms of the president, but we make a fatal mistake if we see Obama as the end and not as the beginning. We make a fatal mistake if we see the entire social motion that coalesced to elect Obama as being complete and finished, and not see it as an arena of struggle. Now, many forces in that coalition won't make it down to the goal line of fundamentally transforming our society. Some will drop out, many will be pushed out. But if we are to fundamentally transform the society, who will we transform it with, if not the progressive forces that are currently behind the re-election of Obama? And I'm sure Winston would remember Lenin, who wrote, "Bear in mind that the struggle for the main thing may blaze up, even though it has begun with the struggle for something partial." Does the phrase bread, peace, and land sound familiar? In a 1951 pamphlet entitled "What It Means to Be a Communist," Winston wrote, "Those who see only backwardness, immobility, and disunity in the working class are bound to ignore the essential truth that it is the working class that possesses all the necessary qualities to bring about the transformation of society and build socialism. Embedded in this movement to re-elect Obama are those forces, the only forces that can bring about the fundamental transformation of this society. Finally, it is important that we honor the life and legacy of Henry Winston, but we must also recognize that Henry Winston was not a great man in spite of being a Marxist-Leninist. He became a great man because he was a Marxist-Leninist. He was not a great man in spite of being a member of the Communist Party. He became a great man because he was a member of the Communist Party. Nothing in his contributions makes sense if separated from the party and its ideology. And yet, his legacy belongs not just to the Marxist-Leninists or to the Communist Party. His legacy belongs to the African American people, to the working class, and to the oppressed people all across this world, who all strive for a better society and a better future. Charlene Mitchell.